Because it's spring, we're going to paint this little rabbit. I included the outline in the extra resources, which you can use as a guide for your own drawing. I tape this 5 by 7 inch watercolor paper down to avoid any buckling, and I use just regular old masking tape. Next, I use my masking fluid to lay down a few highlights. These are pretty minimal. The masking fluid preserves the white of the paper, and you peel it off at the end. I apply this to the eye and a little bit on the ear. And if you don't have masking fluid, just omit this and try to paint around some of these white details. Now, this is the reference photo I'm using. Like I said, I'll include it in your extra resources. When you're painting, make sure you're having your reference photos sitting in front of you for easy reference. Keeping in mind, we will be laying down our lightest colors first and then building the dark up. And the darkest areas are going to be near the belly area here, the muzzle where the whiskers are, and the ears. Let's start by mixing up our colors. First, I mix up a rosy pink for the inner ear. Then I mix up an orange for the lightest fur areas, which I added a bit of reddish brown to desaturate the color. And next, I mix the mid-tone, which is a mixture of purple and brown. Lastly, the darkest color, which will be our shadow color, is a warm gray. I mix in blue, red, brown with a little bit of black. You should get a warm gray. If it's too cool, adjust it by adding a little bit more red or brown. And before I begin painting, I dry the masking fluid with a hairdryer. I start with painting the pink of the ears, and I'm painting right onto the dry paper. When I feel like my brush is drying out a little bit, I dunk it into the water to rehydrate it instead of picking up more pigment, because I want the pink to be on the lighter side, more subtle rather than really pigmented. And I go ahead and I rehydrate my brush several times in this process. And you see next I pick up some of that orange that I pre-mixed and I drop it right at the base of that pink ear, and see how it naturally spreads because the paint is still wet. Now, pre-warning you guys, I'm going to be quite loose with the application of the fur colors. I want to build the colors as I go. Now, keeping in mind the darkest colors are located around the eye, muzzle, ears, and the underside of the belly. And we will be applying the lightest orange first along the top of the head, dropping the mid-tone around the eyes and muzzle. And I'm using a fair bit of water to move the paint around and trying to keep it really loose. I add some coarse salt and leave it to dry. As the salt dries, it will create a good base layer of texture, and I will add salt to the majority of the rabbit. Next, we will move to the body of the rabbit. If you look at the reference photo, you can see the lightest orange will go under the neck, along the back of the rabbit, and under the neck I blend some of those edges. You don't want all hard edges, so soften some of the edges by cleaning your brush, dabbing off the excess water onto a paper towel, and then using the brush to run along the edges to blend them. And I am simply painting the shapes that I see, and try squinting your eyes to see the difference in lights and darks. It can actually really help to get the general shapes you are seeing. So we're going to move on to the belly area. And while the paint is still wet, I drop in the darkest shadow color where the belly is. It is quite shadowed in the area, which is our darkest point of the painting after the eyes. And I add some salt and move on to the next area, which is to the legs. I lay down the orange, again, just trying to paint the general shapes that I see, adding a little dark to the bottom as well. And I can't forget that salt. Using the orange, I pull the color upwards for the light patch on his chest, and I don't want those edges hard, so I clean my brush, I dab off the excess water onto the paper towel, and then using that brush I run it along the edges to blend them out, and I salt it. Now it's quite light on the rabbit's back, it almost merges into the white background, but I want some kind of hint of an edge. So I water down my orange color quite a bit and I lightly paint a strip in that area. And you want to be fairly subtle and light with this. You also want to apply the light orange under the rabbit's chin, blending the bottom edge so it softens into the white body. Next, we move on to the left side of the body, and I blend some of the edges, dropping in clean water to the area as well, which actually creates intentional blooms, which essentially means you're adding more texture to the area because the clean water will essentially move the pigment around unpredictably, and I'm just trying to be really loose. And if you look at the reference photo, you will see that this shadow under the underside of the belly extends quite far up. So I take my darkest shadow color and I drop that right into the wet paint where I see that dark shape. And then I'm going to add salt again. It looks very wet and very messy right now, but the nature of watercolor, it will look a lot lighter than expected. So the messiness and the salt will dry to a wonderful texture, which we will then go on top and add some details that will really bring the whole piece together. You really got to trust the process with this. Then I water down the mid-tone a bit and I add some subtle shading on the white chest area of the rabbit. And at first glance, you may think, oh, it just looks white, but if you squint your eyes or turn the reference photo black and white, you may be able to see the slight difference. I add this watered down mid-tone just under the orange, under the chin, keeping it loose, blending a few of those edges, and I also bring it down to the left front leg. And while the paint is still wet, I go ahead and drop some more of that darkest shadow color onto the left belly area, and using the orange watered down a bit, I use that to outline the left-hand part of the face. Then I decide I have to add even more salt to the belly area. Moving on to the ears, using the mid shade, I block in the ear, leaving a few white areas for some interest. While the paint is still wet, I drop in the darkest shade at the bottom of the ear, as it is slightly darker at the base. And I want to use the mid shade to outline the rest of the ear as well. Go ahead and block in the second ear, and I put salt on that as well. Basically, I put salt on everything. That little cute nose is gonna be pink. And then I go over top of that with a little bit of that mid shade to darken it up a bit. Leave this piece to dry or speed up the process with a hairdryer. At this point, you should have a base with lots of texture and lots of interest. It may look a little bit messy, but we are going to trust the process, like I said, and paint in some details to pull this whole painting together. And if you zoom in on the reference photo, you will actually see there's a little pink around the eye. So I paint in a thin line around the eye. Before you can paint the inner eye, you're going to want to let this dry. So while I wait, I move on to darkening up the other areas. We will start by using the darkest shadow color to darken up the left ear, especially on the inner portion of the ear as it's shadowed by the front section. The muzzle where the whiskers are, like I said, is one of the areas that is the darkest. So we want to add another layer here with the darkest shadow color. I add a line of color right next to the edge of the white, and you will want to clean off your brush, brush off the excess water onto a paper towel and blend that entire edge while pulling the pigment further out to where the whiskers are located. This will darken up the whole area, and then I add some more salt. With the ears, I use the darkest shadow color to darken up the edges of the right hand ear. I don't cover the entire ear, I make sure to blend out that edge as well. And I want to add a little bit more pigment to the neck, so I use some of the orange pigment mixed in with a little of the mid-tone, just adding a bit and blending out the bottom edge. Using the dark shadow color, I'm now going to darken the belly. Because it's quite dark in the reference photo, we just want to boost up that contrast a bit more. So I add a strip of dark where the shadow of the belly is, and then on the top of the left foot to help define that area. And I blend the edges and add some more salt. And I do the same to the right side as well. It's at this point that I'm going to be using more of the orange, and I add this to the left hand foot and along the left hand of the rabbit's body. And it's okay if you cover the dark shadow area a bit with the orange, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be precise, is what I'm saying. So I add a bit more salt and I add the orange to the left shoulder and blend the inner edge. And if you look at the reference photo where the two inner legs touch, there is some dark shadow of the belly peeking through, and we want to paint in this detail using the shadow color. The first time I did this, I must have not liked how it looked because I blotted out the paint that I had put on. So if you're unhappy with a certain area, just blot it up with a paper towel while it's still wet, and I will let it dry before trying again. The left foot is still wet, which I take advantage of and drop some of the dark shadow color in there. In the photo, you can see that some shadowing is near the toes. In this painting, I'm not trying to go for realism, so I don't have to paint exactly what I see. Just the suggestion and the shadows and details is enough to trick the eye, and that's why I can get away with being really messy and suggestive, because I'm building up enough of the right shapes and shadows, and your eye will complete the picture of the rabbit for you. And the key is building up that contrast with just enough detail that your brain can make sense of that picture. Next, I go in and fill the eye with the black. This is the darkest point of the rabbit, and you can go in with straight black if you like. I go ahead and add another layer of dark to the nose as well. I noticed I wanted the left ear a touch darker, so I go ahead with another layer of mid shade. To really ground the entire rabbit, I'm going to add a shadow to the table that he's sitting on so he doesn't look like he's just floating in midair. And I use a black or the dark shadow color we mixed. And you want to add a thin line running along the contour of the rabbit's feet. Then I clean my brush and I blend out the bottom edge to soften it. And I want to talk about last adjustments. So this is the time when I'm making subtle adjustments to the piece, and this will be a personal judgment type thing. I'm just adding a little extra shadowing here and there, maybe some extra splashes of orange. I add in a little extra color right around the eye area, some extra orange around the neck, some extra shadowing around the belly area. And a really helpful tip I found, take a photo of your painting and look at it and look at the reference photo, and you can bounce back and forth between your painting and the reference, and this can really help your eye see if there's an area that needs some extra attention. Maybe sleep on it and look at it again the next day. It's really about training your eye to see those details, like, okay, I need to make this area a bit darker. Maybe I want to add a bit more detail to this area. But with practice, you can start to pick up on those details, which over time will help you achieve a more realistic look. But it takes time and it takes practice, so hang in there. And I'm going to dry the painting completely, and then remember to peel off the little bits of masking fluid that I added. I also add in some whiskers at this point, and you can use a waterproof pen or a dark watercolor. I used a black mixture, but I thought it was a bit too dark, so I went back over it with some white watercolor to tone it all back down again. I thought it just stood out too much. So I would suggest not using straight black, perhaps the shadow color, but water it down a bit so it's lighter, but it's totally up to you. Now, as you probably noticed, I added a lot of salt to this painting. So I actually took it to the sink when it was bone dry. You can't do it when it's still damp or you're going to smear paint everywhere. But using small circular motions, I rubbed it off right back into the sink. Now, I really enjoy the messiness and the looseness of this piece. I don't often paint so loose. I tend to err on the side of more realism, which is a nice change. So, and adding all that salt really gave it fun layers and textures. I did turn this image into stickers for the sticker club, so I hope you enjoyed them as much as I do. And I grew up on a farm which included, I had 8 pet bunnies, so maybe I'm a bit biased why I love this so much. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you'd like to share your creation with me, I always love seeing your progressions and creations, and I'll see you in the next one.